thank you very much for that terrific introduction, Bruce. I'm afraid I'll probably now rather lower the tone, but thank you for joining this webinar tonight, which, despite its rather dry title, is hopefully going to assist delegates in avoiding getting into trouble when working with wildlife, both inside the veterinary practice and also outside at wildlife centres. Now, much of what I'm going to say is actually also going to be relevant for vets working externally with zoos and farm parks, where veterinary input by very necessities tends to be rather limited. So what is the need for this presentation all of a sudden? Well, as Bruce has said, I've worked for many years in the zoological and wildlife field, and over the past 8 years now I've worked for the VDS, and part of my role is handling the claims that come in dealing with non-traditional animals. VDS has recognised an increasing trend of risks in the zoological and wildlife field, not only from the civil authorities, so in other words the police and the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, but also from the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. And there are a lot of grey areas in working with wildlife. So when I became president of BDZS, I decided it would be a good idea to have a look at the wildlife field, and we decided to produce some good practice guidelines, which are now in their final draft format, which we're hoping the government will accept, for vets working in the field with respect to wildlife medicine. So that it's obviously very vital, this rehabilitation work that is done, but it's done on a shoestring budget, and it's quite easy for vets to step the wrong side of the line when it comes to legal principles. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say tonight is going to be quite dry, I'm afraid, and I will try and keep it light, but I'm going to set out the legal principles behind wildlife centres. Next week, my colleague Liz Molyneux, who's very active in the wildlife veterinary world, a highly experienced wildlife vet, will take the principles I'm using tonight and provide a practical method of still managing to treat wildlife without fear of a complaint or a claim from the authorities. So let's start by looking at the surprising number of regulators and authorities who might come to haunt a vet or a veterinary nurse working in wildlife centres or working with wildlife in your practice. The main two, without doubt, are the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, or if you're working in Ireland, the Veterinary Council of Ireland, and I'm going to deal with these in more detail later. But the Veterinary Medicines Directorate are increasingly interested in the supply of medicines to outside premises, and this is going hand in hand with the Controlled Drug Liaison Officers. Now, some of you, if you're working in private practice, may have come across Controlled Drug Liaison Officers already. They appear to have suddenly cottoned on that vets store and supply controlled drugs, and it's a new theme of interest for them, and they're visiting practices up and down the country to check that your controlled drug protocols are robust. They have huge powers of entry, far more than the ordinary police, and the Secretary of State gives them powers to come in and seize any records or documents that you have. So they're quite an important authority that may walk over the veterinary practice's door. The other authorities that get involved are the RSPCA and the police. We've had several claims now where allegations of breaches of the Animal Welfare Act have been brought against veterinary surgeons and veterinary nurses, breaches of the Veterinary Surgeons Act, and finally local authorities are getting interested in what's happening at wildlife centres, because there's a huge number of these rescue facilities up and down the country, and they all have various standards, and people are starting to cotton on that there may be some welfare issues there, and also that they have prescription-only medicines on the facility. The main agency we found coming from the council have been the Environment Agency. They're interested in waste disposal, hence the cartoon figure of the reptile popping out of the clinical waste bag. This was from a story we ran in the newsletter a couple of years ago. As you may know, when you want to kill reptiles, when you're trying to euthanize them, it's actually an incredibly difficult thing to do. They seem to die at the drop of a hat if you're trying not to kill them, but as soon as you try and euthanize them, it's really quite tricky to ensure that they're dead. And this particular reptile, the vet had thought they'd put it to sleep, lobbed it into the clinical waste bin in the consulting room, and when the next family came in, plonked a puppy on the table for its first vaccination, it started barking, and lo and behold, this lizard had crawled out of the waste bin and was crawling towards the daughter, who was somewhat hysterical at the time. That's the sort of thing the Environment Agency get involved in. With wildlife centres, they're looking at the disposal of these animals and some of the zoonotic risks that might be there. So let's have a look at the level of veterinary involvement at wildlife centres in order of increasing risk. There's probably no other section of veterinary work where the economics are so tight and vets are keen to stretch the boundaries because we have a willingness to help people and to treat wildlife at an economic cost. And there are inevitably grey areas, but plenty of what I'm going to say tonight is actually set in stone. It's a legal requirement and therefore should really be followed. The best situation by far, but slightly rare in the UK, is there's a permanent on-site veterinary surgeon, because this will be run very like a veterinary practice and there's unlikely to be any issues. The next best situation is there's no on-site veterinary input whatsoever, and therefore no medicines are stored at the centre, and all casualties are presented to the veterinary practice and seen by a vet. And again, there is little risk in following that protocol. But we probably all know that what is more likely is there are regular visits by veterinary surgeons to the centre, maybe once a month, maybe once a week, maybe once every 2 years, that are being used to give some sort of veterinary input so they can supply drugs to the premises. And perhaps the highest risk of all is the tame vet supplying the little old lady down the road who runs a wildlife centre, does an awful lot of good, or they think they're doing an awful lot of good, and the veterinary surgeon ends up supplying them medicines basically on request, and often with little idea of what's happening at the centre. So that's the highest risk of all. So let's have a look at the 3 types of risk facing any vet or veterinary nurse. Well, it can be professional negligence claims, and in this situation a client seeking money on the basis you failed in your duty of care. In other words, they think there's been a clinical cock-up and they would like some cash back for it, thank you. These are clearly far more common in private veterinary practice than wildlife centres, and they are extremely rare, but it is worth considering claims for consequential losses. Quite a few wildlife centres are open to the public and might have a zoo licence, and if you kill their biggest crowd puller, then you are liable to a claim for consequential losses. And although these are extremely rare, to put it into perspective, we do have a claim at the moment for £250,000 for a falconry centre that was open to the public on odd occasions, and they claim because a bird has been killed by a veterinary surgeon through negligence, such as their allegation, that they have lost £250,000 in gate fees. So they are feasible, but negligence claims are quite rare. And far more common are regulatory complaints from the college, DEFRA, health and safety, or the BMD, and these in turn may overlap with criminal charges, usually either Animal Welfare Act being breached, medicines offences, or breaches of the Veterinary Surgeons Act 1966. There is some good news here. If you're covered with VDS, we cover you for all these eventualities. So these are all set in stone in your policy, and whether it's wildlife, dog, cat or cow, it doesn't really matter. You'll be covered for those 3 risks. There is some bad news, and we better just hide this away at the beginning of the talk. Claims that advice calls to the society increase by 10 to 20% every year, year on year. It's pretty relentless. We're already up by 15% this year. The graphs indicating the number of calls for advice in red, and we did around 18,000 last year, because of course we encourage you to call at the first hint of a problem, or preferably before, and we're certainly receiving